By 1917, the First World War, opposing the Entente to the Central Powers, seemed locked in place. On the Western Front, millions were killed and wounded for a few hundred meters of mud. Repeated attempts to break the stalemate followed, mostly ending in failure or disaster. However, as we will see in this video, the second of a two-part series, the situation was about to change. Not in the trenches of France, but, surprisingly, in the Balkans. There, the First World War would witness a dramatic acceleration to its end by events no one saw coming. The year is 1917. The First World War is still raging. In Greece, a forgotten war theater called the Macedonian Front doesn't seem to go anywhere. There, a few 100,000 men from all around the world, on the side of the Entente, stuck in the Balkan mountains and swamps, are waiting with no strategic purpose. On the Western Front, however, the situation was drastically different. Indeed, hundreds of thousands of lives were uselessly lost during apocalyptic battles such as the Somme Offensive, the Battle of Verdun, and the Second Battle of the Aisne. Each of those endured for months, and here again, for little to no gains. The frustration, disillusionment, and hopelessness caused by these useless bloodbaths were tangible among the soldiery. Mutiny even occurred among the ranks of the French army. At the same time, away from the mud of the trenches, under a warm Mediterranean sun, surrounded by exotic culture, deployment on the Macedonian front was seen, especially in France and to a lesser extent in Great Britain and Italy, as way more enjoyable and cushier. Soldiers on the Western Front compared, with irony and sometimes jealousy, their awful situation to the one of their brothers-in-arms in Greece. The soldiers affected there were subjects of mockeries and taunts back home. They were called the shirkers or gardeners of Salonika, or more literary, beautiful Helen's groom after Helen of Troy, because they had, allegedly, multiple romantic relations with local women. However, even if it was true that the Macedonian front was calmer than the Western one, it was not easier for the troops on a day-to-day basis. In fact, it was quite the opposite. For example, if the men were indeed called gardeners, as they really did gardening, it's because of the lack of supplies. To not starve, the troops resorted to planting and growing their own fresh food in the absence of decent supplies. This is another unknown element of this conflict, the dangerousness of the Mediterranean Sea. Overshadowed by the infamous German unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean Sea was, albeit less dramatic in numbers, as dangerous as the Atlantic Ocean was. This was piling up with poor infrastructures and the impossibility for the Allies to fully requisition resources in officially neutral Greece, while pro-German Greek officials, hostile to the presence of the Allies, were actively hampering good distributions of supplies. To make matters worse, a guerrilla was fought against the Allied troops by Bulgarian-backed partisans called the Komitadji, a heritage of century-long fights against the former Ottoman rulers. The Komitadji would oppose a serious threat to the Allies, aiming at supply lines and isolated soldiers, before disappearing in the mountains, helped by their superior knowledge of the terrain and local support. Last but not least, a great portion of the soldiery was also incapacitated by disease, notoriously ridden with malaria. In fact, it's the mosquitoes, rather than bullets or shells, that neutralized most of the troops in Greece. To give a precise idea on the difficulties of this front is the attitude of the soldiers towards it that gives the best account. When given the choice, after a well-deserved leave, many choose to fight in France instead. So much for this false yet persistent idea of an easy theater. On top of it all, the Allied Army of the Orient, now composed of French, British, Italians, Serbs and Greeks, with Russian regiments until the end of 1917 and the October Revolution, all kept their own structure of command. To coordinate this armed Tower of Babel, the French general Maurice Sarrail was nominally the commander of the whole army, being appointed at the head of the Macedonian Front more because of his political sympathies and acquaintances rather than for his martial capabilities. Sarrail was hardly the man of the situation. Hot-headed and stubborn, arguably unfit for coalition warfare, he managed to antagonize all of the Allied commanders, especially the British ones. The Greek locals also despised him, because the French general saw the country as little more than another French colony, and, being better at politics than warfare, he played with a highly tense Greek political situation, blowing on the embers of a country ready to explode. After multiple complaints from other Allied commanders, and with no major achievement to plead in his favor, he was, unceremoniously, called back to France at the end of 1917. In his wake, his successor was more fortunate and graceful. Because of its human qualities, General Adolphe Guillaume would be the one who both mended the then disastrous relations between the Allies and restored trust between officers and soldiers. Not a political animal and strong with precious experience learned in a French theater, it was he who, at last, truly built the Macedonian Front. All of his efforts aimed for more coordination and improvement, creating a virtuous circle. In just 6 months, the Army of the Orient was unrecognizable, dramatically transformed for the best. From a sad and disillusioned lot, soldiers on the Macedonian Front were now reinvigorated, hopeful, and, most importantly, ready to fight. Called back to France to help the defense of Paris against a German offensive in June 1918, the man who succeeded him now had all the cards in his hand to inflict a severe blow to the Central Powers. The man in question was General Louis Franchet d'Espéret and shared many traits with General Guillaume, including the same energy and affability. Since the beginning of the war, he felt that, unlike the direct attacks on the Western Front, an attack from the rear would be the solution to vanquish the Central Powers. Now strong with the rebuilt army, he could now put his plan into fruition. After analyzing maps and sending reconnaissance flights over the Bulgarian lines, giving him up-to-date intelligence which was cruelly lacking at Gallipoli a few years back, he and his general staff came up with an audacious plan. The daring idea would be to capture the small town of Gradsko, an important Bulgarian supply base 60 kilometers behind enemy lines. The taking of Gradsko would unexpectedly be the domino whose fall would make Bulgaria crumble. However, after increased Allied attacks, the Bulgars had fortified their positions. The only undefended way would be the mountains. Franchet d'Espéret would have to act fast, decisively, and with the full support of his allies. Because disheartened after the failure at Gallipoli in 1915-1916, the British never really wholeheartedly believed in the usefulness of the Macedonian Front. For them, it was merely more than a French waste of time. They even started, in mid-1918, to relocate men from Greece to the Western Front, strategically more important for them. According to Franchet d'Espéret, a crucial victory would have the effect of showing everyone the importance of the military operations in the Macedonian mountains. During the whole summer of 1918, the French general would tirelessly expound his arguments, managing to quell doubts and even to motivate British, Serbs, Greeks and Italians to follow his plan. Also, during the same summer, the Western Front started to move again, helped by the massive arrivals of American troops and the literally groundbreaking new technology of the armored tank. The Allies took back the French city of Amiens in mid-August 1918, initiating the definitive end to the stalemate on the Western Front. Although, despite these successes, the war was not over yet. On the Macedonian Front, everything was also ready, as the fiery French general Franchet d'Espéret didn't wait for his allies' green light to start the preparations. On September 15th, the general assault was launched. The Bulgars opposed a staunch resistance, preferring to die on the spot rather than surrender, but outnumbered and under-equipped, their first and only line of defense crumbled. The objectives of the day, capturing the height of the mountains held by the Bulgarian forces, have all been accomplished. After a week of Allied advance, unstoppable like a hot knife in butter, the Bulgarian front completely sank at Gradsko, and its loot fell into Allied hands. It was godsend for them, now able to leave off the enemy's unreserved, thus immediately carrying on the rest of the operations, gaining precious time. Indeed, it was a real race against time, as the Allied aimed to deny the retreating Bulgarian and 11th German armies any time to reorganize. On September 21st, despite advancing 50 kilometers deep into enemy lines, the Allied headquarters decided to hurry things up, as their troops faced a still well-organized rearguard. The destination of the Bulgarian and German armies was the city of Uskub, an important road and rail hub the Bulgars aimed to use for reorganizing their army elsewhere. Aware of the situation, the Allied HQ decided that it was the moment and place to annihilate the Bulgarian army. The plan was to pursue the enemy and, in parallel, taking Uskub, thus encircling the retreating enemy to completely crush him. Because this daring second part has to be done in parallel and quicker than the main offensive, Franchet d'Espéret had up his sleeve the perfect man for this operation. The man was the audacious Colonel Juino Gambetta, at the head of his Chasseurs d'Afrique, a colonial cavalry unit. The latter accepted his orders without question, and with that, 2,000 men started riding on September 25th. As the plan was to bypass the enemy, they had to find another way than the obvious and Bulgar stock mountain passes. The chosen way would then be the hillside of the mountains. This would be a true ordeal for the French cavalrymen, losing their way many times, following barely marked trails on terrain so steep that horse riding was nothing but impossible. As they had to advance fast, the cavalrymen didn't bother with too much supplies. Now their stomach cried famine, and living out of the land was not an option in this desolated area. The weather too wasn't soft on them, as the days were scorching hot and the nights freezing. Regardless, Juino Gambetta's men carried on relentlessly, motivated by a soon-to-be victory and the prospect of filling their bellies with the enemy's supplies. After these hardships, with fortunately no enemy encounters, they finally reached the outskirts of Uskub on September 29th. The attack was launched in the morning on 3 different sides, on foot and on horseback, against the Bulgarian army, stunned by this total and unwelcome surprise. As planned, such an assault from the mountains was unthinkable on the Bulgarian side. Despite a fierce but disorganized resistance, the French keep advancing. Under enemy artillery fire, Allied reinforcements, who also forced marched through the mountains, arrived on October 1st, acting the definitive fall of the city into their victorious hands. This exploit was somehow echoed by US special forces riding on horseback in the Afghan mountains nearly 90 years later, here too mixing modern way of warfare with practice dating from the dawn of mankind. As up to 70,000 Bulgars and Germans were taken prisoner. The fall of Uskub was cataclysmic for Bulgaria, largely accelerating the downfall of all the Central Powers. It was at this very moment that the Central Powers alliance truly started to crumble. Uskub was the bridge that would make them fall. The Bulgarian army would then go through defeat after defeat until an armistice was signed on September 29th, the first of the Great War and certainly not the last, as the other Central Powers would crumble like a house of cards. Within a month, vanquished Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would also sign an armistice. However, the brightness of these victories would be darkened by the degradation of the relations between the Allies, as political realities were creeping in as winning became, at least, a tangible reality. A situation that will repeat again a few decades later at the end of World War II. Truly, more than any other front, with the obvious exclusion of the Russian Empire, which fell into a civil war after the October Revolution by the Bolsheviks, political elements did play an enormous and toxic role on the Macedonian Front. The French idea to advance on Vienna and then Berlin was denied. The British signed a separate armistice with the Ottomans to secure both the Straits of Marmara and the Bosphorus, while the Italian intensely eyed Albanian possessions, fueled by irredentism. Left alone against the Allies, the German Empire imploded because of civil unrest, and on November 11th, an armistice signed by the new and weak German Republican government finally put an end to the Great War. All of this partly because of a few men and a daring mission on a front the world forgot and European war cabinets had perhaps ridiculed and certainly minimized. Thank you for watching this video on this series on World War I. More untold pages of history are on the way, so if you do not want to miss any, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. These, as you know, helps tremendously. This is Forgotten Fragments. Until next time for the next story.